Just allowing more people to join the webinar today. All right, I think we have a good critical mass coming. My name is Cristina Rombitis Del Rio. I'm a Senior Adaptation and Resilience Advisor at the World Resources Institute and a Policy and Engagement Associate with the Food and Land Use Coalition. Thank you so much for joining us today. I should let you know this webinar is being recorded, and we will have an opportunity for questions and answers with the panelists. So please do use the chat box to submit any questions that you have as they come to mind. Today we have a very distinguished and diverse set of panel of speakers representing, coming from across the globe and representing many different perspectives from the food system and different areas of expertise. We're in a very critical window this week. With last week, we saw the release of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change Working Group 2 report on the impacts of climate change and on adaptation. And this report really highlighted the changes that we're already seeing and their impacts on food systems and water systems and food and water security, as well as projected changes with high confidence that if we're not able to keep warming below 1.5 degrees, there will be high food security risks due to climate change, leading to malnutrition, micronutrient deficiencies, especially in places like Sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, South America, and small island states, and even greater severity with higher degrees of warming. This next week, we will see the Convention on Biodiversity have its final technical meeting ahead of the second part of the Conference of Parties, which is expected to be in August, though it has been postponed multiple times. Next week's meeting is meant to deliver a draft post-2050 global biodiversity framework, which is meant to guide efforts this decade to halt the destruction of nature and increase biodiversity. Our global food systems and our ability to feed 7 and soon to be 8 billion people with nutritious, safe, affordable, and healthy food is really at the nexus of both of these issues, with agriculture being a significant source of greenhouse gas emissions, about 30%, but also agriculture being very much impacted by the impacts of climate change, and especially for those on the front lines of climate change. And of course, agriculture expansion is the #1 main driver of global biodiversity loss, as has been highlighted by many recent reports. And biodiversity loss will continue to accelerate unless we change the way we produce food. But it's not all doom and gloom. There are promising solutions, and the IPCC report highlighted the importance of nature-based solutions and natural climate solutions to build resilience to climate change. There are a number of sustainable, regenerative, and nature-positive agricultural practices that are starting to take hold and being scaled up. And on the consumer end of things, there's increasing awareness that dietary shifts really present an opportunity to combat the negative impacts of agriculture and food production, and that this can be done in a culturally appropriate way with the right sorts of policy supports. As we take a look back at the past year, we had a really great series of moments with the Food Systems Summit, the first ever Food Systems Summit, looking at the totality of food systems. We had the Climate Change Conference of Parties in Glasgow in November, which really highlighted nature and the importance of nature and protecting nature, but less visibility into agriculture and food systems within that context. So as we're looking ahead to the Biodiversity COP, to the Climate Change COP in Egypt, which will be an African COP, we hope there will be much more focus on food, agriculture, land use, nutrition, and biodiversity. And it's really an opportunity that we have this week and going forward to join the dots, because we really can't tackle climate change and biodiversity loss without changing the way we produce and consume food, without distinct food system transformations. So we're going to have the opportunity to join those dots today through a conversation with a panel of experts. I'm very pleased that we have with us Morgan Gillespie. She's the Global Director of the Food and Land Use Coalition and is really a visionary leader guiding food system transformations in partnership through the FOLU Coalition. We have Henry Neufeld, who is the head of Impact Assessment and Adaptation Analysis for the United Nations Environment Program Copenhagen Climate Center, and is a lead author on the latest IPCC report, and will give us an overview of the latest science. We have Shenggen Fan, who's the Dean of the Academy of Global Food Economics and Policy at the China Agriculture University, and he's also an ambassador for the Food and Land Use Coalition, who will give us a grounded perspective from policy, but also from China, who is the host of the Biodiversity Conference of Parties. And of course, that's where so many of these issues come to a head. And finally, we'll have Sarah Jones, Associate Scientist for the Alliance of Biodiversity International and the International Center for Tropical Agriculture, now collectively known as ABC, who will give us a preview of some recent policy research on ways that we can meet multiple related targets related to climate change and biodiversity conservation. So if I might, Morgan, let's start with you. Let's jump right in. Maybe you can start by telling us what the Food and Land Use Coalition is, and why we need to talk about food and biodiversity this year in particular.
Absolutely. It's a pleasure to be here and delighted to speak to so many of you today. So the Food and Land Use Coalition is a coalition of actors of 9 global institutions dedicated to transforming food and land use systems in line with the Paris Agreement, so ensuring 1.5-degree pathways, in line with the Sustainable Development Goals, of course, and also in line with the Convention on Biological Diversity. Now, we were established in 2017, so we're still only about 5 years old, but we really try to support science-based solutions to help build a shared understanding of both the challenges, which we'll talk a lot about today, but also the opportunities that we believe are necessary to unlock collective and ambitious action. Now, Christina, you asked why biodiversity, sort of why now? Sort of 2 main things I want to flag. As you already mentioned, the CBD has been delayed several times, right? But we are delighted and thrilled and keeping our fingers secretly crossed that it is now going to take place. It's likely to take place from the 20th of August through the 11th of September of this year. The CBD COP15 is critically important. We need to agree an ambitious global biodiversity framework that can track our progress to reverse biodiversity loss over the next 8 years. This framework is already 2 years overdue. That was primarily due to COVID. We can't help that, but we really can't afford to waste any more time. Now, next week, as you mentioned, I think it's the 13th through the 29th of March, we're going to see the last technical session for the CBD held in Geneva, which is fantastic. And this is the last opportunity for governments to negotiate on once in a decade global agreement before it arrives in the second part of COP later this year. Now, one thing that's important to note, finance is critical to this transition. Without adequate finance on the table, hugely diverse developing countries are not going to be able to protect their biodiversity. Now, I want to talk a little bit about the problems. I know we've talked about the problems so much, but it's important to kind of contextualize ourselves, like, why do we care? I'm curious to see how many people on the line have read the most recent IPCC report. I'd love it if you'd drop into the chat box, yes, we've read it, no, we haven't. But this report was really rather scary, if I'm honest. It really shows that climate change is already having significant impacts on nature, on people, and of course on our food systems. We know that our food system is one of the biggest drivers of biodiversity loss, and we've known that for quite some time. But our food production systems are also destroying the very elements, the soil, the water, the pollinators, the bees that we need, that are absolutely fundamental to producing food. Now, the IPCC report tells us that climate change will put more pressure on food production, but also on access to food. And this is going to be especially felt in vulnerable regions. It will undermine food security for hundreds, if not billions of people. It will reduce access to nutrition. We're expecting to see increases in the frequency and the intensity and the severity of droughts, of floods, of heat waves, of continued sea level rise, even at 1.5 degrees. And that's not the scariest bit. The scariest bit is if we go above 1.5 degrees, right? And the IPCC report starts to articulate, if we get to 2 degrees, what happens? And that means that food security risks due to climate change are going to be even more severe, leading to malnutrition and micronutrient deficiencies. It will further weaken our soil health. And again, why do we care about soil health? Because we grow our fruits and vegetables in soil. We need our soil to produce the food that we eat. It will also weaken our ecosystem services, such as pollination, which obviously undermines food productivity in many, many regions across the world. I want to make this a little bit personal. We as people rely on nature. We as people rely on biodiversity to regulate the environment, to maintain a habitable planet. And I think sometimes it's easy to forget that. I'm in London. I don't know where folks listening in are, but in our cities, when we walk down the streets, it's easy to forget how reliant we are on this amazing planet that provides so much for us. Now, food systems require a huge diverse range of plants and bacteria for the direct supply of food, including its nutritional value. And we need this biodiversity to sustain the underlying ecosystem processes that make agriculture possible. But today's system, as I said, isn't working for people, and it's not working for planet. I'll pause there and see, Christy, if you have any more questions, but I want to have a little bit of time to talk about what the solution might be.
Thanks, Morgan. Yes, we definitely will get into the solutions, and I know that's your disposition is to be positive. But thank you for spelling out the issues and making it personal, because so many of these connections can be very academic, very difficult to see and understand. Henry, I'm going to turn to you next as an IPCC author, to give us a little bit more about the latest findings in the IPCC report, which Morgan already highlighted are quite scary. But we also want to hear some of the solutions and some of the key findings on the links between climate, food, and biodiversity that were highlighted in the report.
Yes, thank you. And thanks for having me on this panel. It's a real pleasure and great to be here. I'm happy to share. Just got a flash note, was startled for a second. So I'm really happy to share some of the key findings of this latest report. This is the second working group report of the IPCC's sixth assessment report cycle. And I think as Morgan already said, it's really scary. And the key headline message is there is unequivocal evidence that climate change is a threat to human well-being and health of the planet. And any further delay in concerted global action will miss a brief and rapidly closing window to secure a livable future. I think that sentence really says it all in terms of the need to act urgently and decisively, both on mitigation and adaptation, to avoid the worst impacts. We are only beginning to see some impacts on the ecosystems, on food systems, and on people exposed or vulnerable to climate hazards. And this will just grow and increase as we increase with temperatures. And anything that goes beyond 1.5 degrees is really, really difficult to sustain. And I'd also like to make this personal in the sense that we who have created this situation have a sort of moral obligation to provide our children and future generations with a world in which they can thrive. And right now, we're totally missing that opportunity, the remaining opportunity, and we're leaving them with a really big mess. So just to talk about a few current impacts and projected impacts, and then say a few other things about possible solutions. There is an increased frequency and intensity and duration of weather extremes that has already driven some mass mortalities in tree species and coral losses, and has led to hundreds of local extinctions. About 50% of the plants, animals, and marine species are already moving poleward or to higher altitudes, sorry. And this is leading to changes in existing ecosystems and trophic systems, and ultimately leading to less resilient ecosystems. Also, climate change is already strongly impacting food systems via agriculture, forestry, fisheries, and aquaculture. This is affecting human needs. Agricultural production has slowed in mid and low latitudes. There is increased tree mortality in many temperate and boreal biomes. There are decreased sustainable yields in some wild fish populations. Warming and acidification have affected farmed aquatic systems. So these are already effects we can measure, we can see. Warming has also altered key biological events, flowering, insect emergence, for instance. That's leading to effects on food quality and harvest stability. And there have been changes in the distribution of terrestrial, marine, and freshwater species we use. And that also is affecting food security in all dimensions. Climate extremes have already affected productivity in agriculture and fisheries. For instance, in 2016, the El Nino droughts caused food insecurity in Eastern and Southern Africa and Central America. And in the Northeast Pacific Ocean, a recent 5-year warm period affected migration, distribution, and abundance of key fish resources. Now, of course, let's bear in mind that all of these effects on food security are most affecting the vulnerable groups of people and countries. So projected impacts, there is a risk of biodiversity loss in forests and kelp, seagrass, and warm water corals. And this risk is expected to increase beyond 1.5 degrees Celsius. Sea level rise will further expose low-lying coastal ecosystems, such as mangroves, and multiple climate hazards can occur simultaneously, and that compounds the risk. Wildfires will increase and increasingly affect ecosystems, and exceeding 1.5 degrees Celsius for extended periods of time we'll see more species extinctions and losses of ecosystems, such as tropical coral reefs, coastal wetlands, and mountaintop ecosystems. And then ecosystems that currently store carbon, like forests or peatlands, could become a source of, through fires, increased decomposition and degradation or savannization in tropical rainforests, for instance. In the Amazon, we know that that's already underway, and tipping points are being highlighted as we don't know how to quantify them, but they could be rather imminent. There is a risk of extinction in biodiversity hotspots that will increase to about the tenfold if we go up to 3 degrees plus. And continued warming will have major impacts on food systems, undermining food security in sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, Central America, and small island development states. So we can see that the impacts are just growing the more we go beyond 1.5 degrees Celsius, which we've already basically committed to.
Yeah.
Now, why is protecting and enhancing nature and transforming our food systems so critical to meeting the Paris Agreement? It's because food systems contribute to climate change with over 35% of all emissions. I mean, food systems is not only the production, which goes up to 25%, including land use change. But if you include the food systems, it is more than 30, 35, maybe even 40% of all emissions. And then resilient food systems are critical to long-term sustainability, food security, and the protection of nature. So these things interact. We need to have mitigation and adaptation in order to maintain long-term food security and long-term sustainable food systems. Climate change, biodiversity loss, and land degradation are so closely linked together that we cannot solve these challenges if not together. This nexus is that climate change is affecting the stability of ecosystems, it's reducing the resilience, and it is enhancing land degradation, which is largely driven through our land management processes. So we need to address these things together. Governance and just transitions that enable smallholder farmers and indigenous peoples, local communities to engage, have ownership and appropriate tenure and land access rights can help us build more sustainable systems. Scaling up these integrated approaches is really critical. Finance has been mentioned, and it's currently not nearly enough. But we have to be aware that there are winners and losers in this situation, as always. And the big corporations that tend to benefit from large-scale operations and demand that is met, demand in the global north that is met in the global south is driving a lot of the land use change and hindering more sustainable approaches. And we need to look at these things both at the global scale, the national scale, and at the local scales to ensure that the governance systems we set up actually work for those at the ground and still allow us to meet our needs. And for that, I think it's really important that we overcome a lack of political will. In many instances, it is difficult to overcome vested interests and local losses. And that's why we need to have sort of local context-specific solutions for different questions. And I'll stop here, and hopefully there will be more questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Henry. Thanks for giving us an overview of the science and the findings. As someone highlighted in the chat, the report is quite long, so it is helpful to have these synthesis and these summaries. But also thank you for highlighting the equity issues. We so often forget that those that are at the bottom of the pyramid and assume that rising tide will lift all boats, when we know that's actually not the case, and we need to pay special attention to the equity issues, and also local, the fact that we need locally determined actions and locally led decision making across the board. It's great to see people introducing yourselves in the chat. Please continue to do so. And already there's a hunger for solutions. There's a hunger to identify, well, what do we do about this? So I'm going to turn next to Schengen. And Schengen, you've had an extremely distinguished career looking at so many of these issues over time. And I'd love to hear your perspective, sitting in China on which is the host of the CBD, as I said, about what are the tools that we have at our disposal to ensure that food systems put less pressure on biodiversity. How do we start to address this problem, in your view? And Schengen, it looks like you're trying to talk, but we can't see you or hear you. Sounds like there might be a technical issue. Oh, now we can kind of hear you, but not super clearly. Maybe while we try and sort that out, I might go next to Sarah. We do want to hear from you, Schengen, but let's see if we can both hear and see you more effectively, because right now, at least for me, you're a dark screen. Okay, let's return. We'll come back to you, Schengen, but let's go next to Sarah Jones. Sarah, I know you've got a paper forthcoming and some policy analysis looking at biodiversity and climate targets. I guess my top line question is, can we do both? Can we meet our biodiversity goals and produce the food that we need? And also reduce our climate impacts and meet those global targets?
Yeah, great question. And thanks so much for inviting me here to be part of this event. So indeed, we have been working on a policy brief on biodiversity as part of the FABLE consortium. The FABLE consortium is it's an acronym for Food, Agriculture, Biodiversity, Land Use, and Energy. It's a network convened by FOLU that Morgan introduced earlier, and includes research and policy institutes from 20 countries that work together to develop integrated national pathways towards food and land systems that aim to meet global sustainability targets. And so the purpose of this biodiversity brief is to highlight the central role that food and land use sector can have in contributing to global biodiversity targets, and also to share a bit how the FABLE network and the tools that we have developed can help identify what the solutions might look like. So I just wanted to highlight what the link is between food systems and global biodiversity targets. As Henry mentioned, biodiversity loss is now happening in every country. The World Wildlife Fund estimated last year in the Living Planet report that 68% of mammals, birds, fish, and other vertebrate species have been lost between 1970 and 2016. And critically, agriculture expansion and intensification are major drivers of these losses. So against that backdrop, biodiversity has a profound effect on our food systems because biodiversity plays such a critical role in them. We all depend on the crop and fish and livestock diversity that we enjoy eating. And then we also depend on pollinators and soil biodiversity to maintain healthy, productive food systems. So all that to point out that the challenge of meeting future food requirements and halting biodiversity loss are intrinsically linked. So in this brief, we assessed the possibility to achieve 3 global biodiversity targets by 2050 that have been proposed by the Convention for Biological Diversity in the post-2020 framework, and which governments are getting ready to commit to at the next Global Biodiversity Conference this year. The first of these targets is to halt losses in natural land, where natural processes like animal reproduction and plant dispersal can take place with very little human disturbance. And then the other 2 targets are to use restoration to achieve net increases in these natural land areas, with a target of 5% increase by 2030 and a 15% increase by 2050. So these global targets aim to try and turn the biodiversity crisis around. And what we found using our modeling approach is that under current trends in food and land use systems, none of these global targets will be met. But the good news is it would be possible to achieve the 2 restoration targets and have a 15% increase in land for nature by shifting food and land systems towards a more sustainable pathway. And this sustainable pathway includes actions like committing to large afforestation, shifting diets, putting constraints on agricultural land expansion, reducing food losses, and other actions defined by country teams. But what's key is that in the sustainable pathway, the global biodiversity targets can be met while also meeting healthy diet recommendations and reducing greenhouse gas emissions in line with the SDGs and the Paris Agreement targets. Getting us on track to achieving global biodiversity targets is going to require ambitious policies and actions in all countries, which are not easy to implement. So just an example, in our sustainable pathway, Mexico is able to increase its share of land for nature by over 50% through restoration of cropland and pasture. But freeing up this agricultural land requires that people shift towards diets that involve slightly less meat consumption. It also requires that there's an increase in pasture productivity and that there's an increase in imports of some livestock products and animal feed. So the improvements that are possible to achieve in Mexico require changes both at the production side of the food system and at the consumption. And looking across all countries that we've considered in our analysis, we find that there's a few key actions that can really help achieve these global biodiversity targets and while still meeting food production and climate mitigation goals. And these are really shifting to healthier diets, which means different things in different places, increasing crop and livestock productivity, and limiting agricultural expansion. Other actions are also important, but these ones really stand out. And taking actions like this in multiple countries could put us on track to achieve global biodiversity targets. And I think that's really good news. It's an important message from this brief, is that we don't have to anxiously watch biodiversity being lost and worry about it. We have the means to stop it. And I'm really hopeful that this year's conference and the discussions that are happening around biodiversity can stimulate and drive forward actions now to shift us towards more sustainable food systems.
Thanks so much, Sarah. So it is possible, but we need to address both the consumption side and the production side, make some changes across the food system, across the board, and especially in some key countries. That is good news indeed, but now the tough part, how do we make those changes? How do we make those shifts? And we have Schengen back with us. Schengen, welcome. Thank you for rejoining. Hopefully we can hear you now. What I'd love to hear from you, from your perspective, is what are those policy tools? What are those measures that we have to start putting in place some of the changes that Sarah was talking about that we need to do in order to meet our biodiversity and climate goals?
Christina, can you hear me now?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, wonderful, wonderful. So I changed it to the line system instead of Wi-Fi. That works. Good, yes. Okay. Now, as a person who have worked on agriculture and food for 35 years, on the one hand, I'm very proud. On the other hand, I'm also feel very guilty. Okay, the proud comes from the Green Revolution, adoption of new technologies, from CGIAR, from agriculture research systems. So we were able to feed billions of people. So without those technologies, we would not be able to feed billions and billions of mouths. So I feel very proud of that. On the other hand, as the time moves on, our system, agriculture and food system, have become unsustainable. They use too much water, too much land, biodiversity loss. Everybody has already discussed, 60 to 70% of biodiversity loss is from agriculture, from food production. So it's a huge number. In the meantime, the system also do not produce healthy, nutritious food for everybody in the world. So I feel guilty in this regard. So what can we do? So last year we produced a report here in China called China and the Global Food Policy Report to really try to tackle some of the key policy issues as Christina has asked me to answer. So number one is actually to optimize or repurpose the government support. So right now we spend almost $1 trillion subsidies that destruct our ecosystem. So 1 trillion. $500 billion is for agriculture production. So these subsidies are not sustainable. They do not produce healthy, nutritious foods. But in the meantime, they cause huge damage to our food system, including the loss of biodiversity. So we need to repurpose them, keep them in our system, and to reuse them for different purposes, for producing healthy, nutritious food, for promoting more sustainable practices. So we'll call it repurposing or optimizing. There is a strong research group, a strong, let's say, alliance working on it, not just research. The second is technology.
Can you give us a tangible example of what that repurposing could look like?
Yeah, so for example, here in China, we used to provide subsidies for fertilizers. The farmers overuse fertilizers. Now the government introduced new policies that is zero increase of fertilizers starting from 2016. You're removing natural subsidies and use that money for, let's say, promoting technologies, innovations, or give farmers direct income support. So this is very concrete. Many countries are doing that. So China is also doing it. So the subsidies. Now the technology, I think today the technology must have multiple wins, not just a win in yield, in production, but also win in nutrition, win in sustainability, win in climate mitigation. Nutrition part, CGI has a very sort of wonderful research group called Harvest Plus. By adding micronutrients into food crops, you will harvest more nutrition per unit of food. So right now, 40 billion smallholders are producing and consuming biofortified foods with very rich micronutrients. And climate adaptation, we have already seen lots of wheat varieties, maize varieties that can help to adapt to heat waves, to droughts. And we must combine all this together. So I wish it's a one seed that has multiple its traits: drought resistance, high yielding, more nutrition. So all this have to come together. Otherwise, you push for high yielding, but in the meantime, you use lots of fertilizers, you actually increase carbon emissions. It's not acceptable. So multiple wind technologies. The third one is actually diets. Diets. What we eat really matter. What we eat matter. So if we can take into consideration of our health, of course, when we eat, but in the meantime, if we can take into consideration of our environment, let's say eat less meat or less high carbon intense foods or high resource intense foods. So we can save more land, save more water, save more species in the world. So we can do it. We can change our diets in doing that. So more plant-based foods, and that can help us to reduce its overweight, obesity, lots of non-communicable diseases. Meantime, we protect our world. Now, finally, the governance. I think many have already mentioned. Right now, agriculture is working in silo, environment is working in silo, health is working in silo. Can we combine them together? Started with a national level. Can we have a national czar or national coordination mechanism to bring all the ministries together to make sure that we minimize trade-off and maximize synergies? So I have already seen some of the big trade-offs. For example, one government agency is promoting, let's say, national parks, but in the meantime, food security is compromised, and health is also compromised. So how can we combine all this together? I truly believe, there are lots of win-win-win opportunities for different levels of governance to work together. So to change the governance. Okay, going back to Christina.
Thank you, Shengen. Fantastic. So we have repurposing subsidies, we have more innovation, we have improved governance, breaking down the boxes, and diets as key solutions. I want to go back to Morgan because you tantalized us saying you have some solutions as well and some innovations and ideas. So I want to hear those. And we will go to the audience questions. We have a lot of questions piling up, so please do keep them coming. But Morgan, tell us what you think about solutions.
I mean, I think actually, Christina, that Shengen did an incredible job covering a good basis of those. So I'm just going to have maybe two high-level comments. One, I think, and just to ground it, because I know in listening to this conversation, it feels sometimes really overwhelming, and then the solutions are technical, they're political, they're consumer driven, and that can also be difficult. But I do want to highlight that the opportunity here far, far, far outweighs the costs, right? It's important to remember that our current food system costs us about $12 trillion a year in damage. And that's broken down to about $7 trillion of human health. Shengen mentioned obesity, diabetes, but also malnutrition is a challenge. $3 trillion of damage to the environment, and another $2 trillion in economic damages from our current food system. And these systems are just really grossly inefficient. We have lots of people that don't have access to safe, nutritious, and sufficient food. And we have a third of food being wasted. Food loss and waste is a massive issue that we haven't really touched upon. I have a stat here that if food loss and waste was a country, it would be the third largest emitter of greenhouse gases. Can you imagine that? The third largest country in the world just because of the food we throw away every day. And we have people starving in other parts of the world. So the opportunity to change the system far, far, far outweighs the cost of the system that we're currently in. And it's a complete myth that we have to choose between either economic growth or environmental sustainability, right? Those two things we know now can be mutually achieved. Transforming our food and land use systems, including enhanced biodiversity, will absolutely deliver stronger, more equitable growth for more people, which is great, at the same time as being able to deliver our environmental targets. So I'll actually stop there, because as I said, I think Schengen went through like a very long list of interventions, but I just wanted to call out that this is possible. I mean, Henry said we have a moral obligation, of course, but it's possible. We know how, we know what we need to do, and the benefits vastly outweigh the cost of continuing in this broken system.
Fantastic. Thank you, Morgan. Yes, we do know how, and that's what I want to get deeper into. One of the questions that popped out from the Q&A box from Paul DeWitt is, how do we introduce food systems and dietary change into the revisited NDCs? These are the nationally determined contributions for the next climate change conference of parties. So these are countries' plans for how they're going to meet their Paris Agreement targets. How can we get food and dietary shifts into that? Does anyone want to take that question? Has anyone done some thinking on that? I'm seeing if anyone wants to jump in.
I
Yeah.
can. It's a tough question to bring in the question of dietary change and, for instance, food waste and loss into the nationally determined contributions. And that is because they are based on the national greenhouse gas inventories. And these inventories follow certain rules that do not acknowledge many of the changes that would be necessary, such as dietary change, such as for instance, restoration efforts. They are not covered through the added value and additionality requirements of the nationally determined contributions. So the system that we face within the UNFCCC does not allow for these kind of things to be accounted. But we, of course, know that it would be useful for national governments to acknowledge and take a more integrated approach, a nexus approach that looks at not only greenhouse gas emissions coming from agriculture or forestry land use change, but really addresses the elements of land use change and food systems, dietary change, and waste and loss reduction in an integrated way, but you just can't account for it within the NDCs in that way. It would become something that you describe in more qualitative terms. You can make these plans, but it's hard to account for them within the system that has been established for the UNFCCC. Now, I think it is possible to integrate, for instance, the biodiversity and the land degradation conventions with the climate change conventions, in the sense that different tools are applied. You know, you have the attempt to reduce emissions, enhance removals from climate change in the UNFCCC. In the climate convention, you have increase in land protection through biodiversity convention, and also sort of reducing land degradation and desertification in the third convention, but they follow different tools and different approaches. And as Schengen was already mentioning, we need to have sort of whole of government approaches to coordinate these different measures so that they do not contradict each other and they do not lead to unintended consequences and trade-offs when we implement them. And that's difficult, of course. That's really challenging because there are losers and winners. And when we do these changes, we don't necessarily have the benefits of nature-based solutions don't always accrue to the people on the ground. So we have to be really careful when we do these things. I'll stop here, but there's so much in the nitty-gritty elements that we need to be take into consideration. Sorry.
Yeah.
Christina, can I just add on to that? Because I think we're all set, because we know it's really tough, because there's, as Henry just outlined really, really clearly, it's very difficult to move this into the NDCs because of the technicalities that Henry sort of described. But Fable and the Fafolu coalition launched at COP26 an analysis of existing NDCs as it related to the Afolu sector. And Henry and Schengen, you guys will be not surprised at all to hear that only half of the analyzed NDCs even mention policies that are explicitly linked to actions in the food and land use sector. There are only 2 NDCs that provided specific information on funding, which we know is critical to support the transitions of more sustainable food and land use systems. And there are only 5 NDCs that refer to integrated spatial information and planning, which obviously underpins, land use management. So within the existing NDC structure, it's really difficult to talk about driving consumer shifts in diets for sure. But there's an opportunity now in time for the 2023 COP27 stock take, the 2025 stock take, to improve the NDCs by deeper integration of food and land use systems. And we should be working with countries around the world to strengthen their NDCs to be more inclusive of these systems, not only to get us to 1.5 degrees, but because of the co-benefits that offers in terms of biodiversity, improved nutrition, et cetera, et cetera.
So I hear one part governance, one part of the problem is tools, having the right tools to guide the policy, and then fundamental ambition and the need to have that integrated approach in the way we tackle climate change as well as biodiversity. Is that kind of about more or less right? But some promise on the way. At least some countries are starting to do this, but we need much, much more. We're running short on time, so I'm going to ask a few questions that have come up in the chat and see who would like to answer them. There's a question from Fred Atieno regarding local and context specific solutions, which Henry mentioned earlier. How do you keep that local decision making, that local character, while you're also achieving scale? Because we know this can't be a piecemeal approach, and we need to do things at scale, especially when we're talking about conservation of biodiversity, which often requires a much bigger scale of action than at the local level. And then there was another question that I want to highlight. There's so many good questions. This one's from Syed, saying, by increasing agriculture biodiversity and the diverse species and systems, how we can contribute to global biodiversity targets, improve nutrition and healthier diets. But what's stopping us from doing this? So what are some of those key barriers that we need to address? I know Schengen, you already addressed the kind of innovation challenge, the governance challenge, and the issue of needing to repurpose subsidies. But what are some of the other factors that we need to tackle to get the system change going? So anyone want to jump in on those questions? Schengen.
I wanted to add the role of the private sector. I mentioned about the citizens. We need to change our behavior, our eating behavior. But the private sector really needs to be incentivized, mobilized. And here in China, I just cannot see very active private sector moving forward. At global level, I did see some of the multinational companies like Unilever. They have committed to achieve carbon neutrality by certain years, and it's by 2030 or by 2025 or whatever. But here in some of the large emerging economies, Brazil, China, India, and South Africa, I have not seen active private sectors. Without them, we will not be able to move fast enough. But there is a question for me, biochar, China is pushing biochar. Yeah, I think biochar is an interesting story. Definitely, it has some promising results. But I want to go beyond just biochar. But here in China, we are really promoting organic fertilizers through government-supported program. So moving away from chemical fertilizer. But in the meantime, you do need to to feed the crops, right? Crop need nutrients. So how can we really promote a more organic sort of fertilizers for farmers to use is also very promising. Now, the circular agriculture, regenerative agriculture, a livestock and a crop mix system, all this can contribute to more efficient, more effective, and probably more sustainable, and even producing more nutritious, healthy foods from the local level. Going back to you, Christina.
Thanks, Shengen. Anyone else want to come in? I see Henry.
Yeah.
Henry and then Sarah.
Great. Thanks. I just wanted to pick up where Shengen stopped somewhat, and also address the first question that you asked. How do you bring in the local transition to to sustainable management land practices? And I think the short answer is to bring in local stakeholders and ensure their buy-in and that they benefit from these changes. That is crucial. They need to see clear benefits in terms of job creation, income, education, health, the basics of a sustainable livelihood. Ultimately, these changes need to be visible to the local stakeholders. Then you will get the buy-in. Now, how do you scale up private sector engagement in making these more sustainable land use systems? I'll just talk about nature-based solutions in agroforestry as one example of nature-based solutions. Agroecology is another, where we can see that transitioning from a conventional practice to these more integrated, sustainable land management practices comes at a cost, at least at the beginning. You see, when you transition, you lose income, and you only see the benefits of your transition, the ecosystem services, longer term. Everybody acknowledges that there are these massive benefits in terms of ecosystem sustainability, water, soil health, income, you name it, but they accrue over time. And to overcome the initial costs of implementing these more sustainable systems, we need to direct subsidies and provide the necessary resources through public-private partnerships, for instance, because the private sector will not come in over longer-term only long-term benefits. When you have low-hanging fruit, the private sector will come in. But if you have longer-term transitions to make, you need to provide blended finance solutions that enable that transition to happen. And I'll stop here. Thanks.
Thanks, Henry. Yeah, absolutely. There's a role for the public sector in enabling that. Sarah, did you want to come in next?
Yeah, now we're giving a lot of responses to this one question, but it's a good question. And I just wanted to add that I think consumers have a role to play here as well. So we can shift, or consumers everywhere can shift and encourage businesses to support local and diversified production systems. And so, yeah, I think that's key. And then also public procurement schemes and public regulations that support shorter supply chains and diversified farming systems can also play a real role. And I gave an example in one of the answers of a very nice scheme in Brazil that has encouraged public procurement from local diversified farms in school canteens. And that's had a positive impact on local nutrition and on biodiversity on farms. And then finally, just to say, I think also evidence and science and models that show actually diversified farming systems and biodiversity in agricultural landscapes can have a positive impact. And also to dispel some myths about that. I think there's been a prevailing myth that it's not profitable, that's actually not true. So trying to provide the facts and make farmers and government confident about investing in alternative systems is also important.
Thanks, Sarah. Fantastic examples. Henry, you want to come back on that?
No, I don't. Actually, I wanted to add one thing that we've touched upon briefly, and Shengen has mentioned it, I think I would like to go also beyond the question of nutrient-rich food, as you know, in the past, the CGIAR, the green revolution has achieved incredible benefits, but also lots of trade-offs. I still think that technology and innovation have a major role to play. Dietary shift and changes in behaviors are somewhat not very scalable, I think. I'm not so convinced that we can convince everybody to live very healthy. There are changes and limits here, but I think technological change can overcome a lot of our problems. And for me, for instance, gene editing is a clear solution for many of the questions to increase productivity, enhance resilience in food system and plants and animals that we use in our food systems. I think we just need to be much more open to opportunities that come from that side as well. Not only land management changes and governance are going to do the trick. I think we're going to have to look at the whole bandwidth of opportunities and solutions. Stop here. Thanks.
So emphasis on those technological breakthroughs that are needed. I wonder if anyone wants to challenge you on the dietary shifts, whether that's going to be transformative or not. I'm looking to see if anyone wants to come in on that. It might come into the chat. A somewhat related question from Stephen Finn, who says, as we've mentioned, we know we have a moral responsibility to change our food system to halt climate change and biodiversity loss. I'm always looking for key themes that unite stakeholders in this effort. And I'm curious, what do the panelists see as universal motivating and messaging factors that can unite policymakers, companies, and individuals to adopt an urgent mindset or action focus? So what is getting people to motivate that change? And of course, we have different kind of stakeholders to think about. Does anyone have any good examples? I know we're all looking for this.
I wanted to, sorry, next I can.
Yeah, go ahead, Cheng.
Can you hear me? Yeah, I wanted to address Henry's question about the dietary change. I fully agree that the technologies from CGIAR, from National Research System, will play a very critical role. There's no doubt, with the genetic thing, synthetic technology and so on. But I think a dietary change could also have pretty big potential. We have done some modeling exercise here in China. Well, for the last 20 years, China has, maybe even 30 years, experienced a rapid nutrition transition from undernutrition, from hunger to overweight, obesity, and lots of non-communicable diseases. That's partly because we ate not the wrong things, maybe too much meat, too much carb, but meantime, not much fruits, vegetables. So if we can shift that diet towards not only for health reasons, but also for, let's say, for sustainability, that potential is huge. We can actually help to reduce the carbon emission from ag food system by maybe 25%, even 30%. Even within meat, chicken is more efficient than beef, or seafood is probably more carbon neutral or lower carbon than others. So even within meat, you have different choices. And it happens that not so sustainable foods actually are also healthy foods. so you have actually win-win. So there's no doubt, Henry, I'm not going to challenge you about the role of technology, absolutely. But do not underestimate the change of the diets.
Yes, can I just quickly answer that question? I mean,
yeah, and then I'm going to bring Morgan in. She wants to come in as well. But briefly,
absolutely.
Henry.
I don't want to take the floor too much. And I totally agree with the need for dietary change. Don't get that wrong. But I have a sense from empirical psychology and economics that is actually quite challenging. I mean, for us in the rich world, we are making changes in our dietary, in our diets to less meat, and yet the effects are quite small still. At the same time, developing countries and emerging economies are changing their food habits to more meat and more energy dense diets. And that is actually causing more emissions. So I see these changes as really challenging to achieve. That's why I'm sort of a bit skeptical that we can make that transition, and the scale at which this needs to take place within the time frame that we have to stay within the 1.5 degrees Celsius. It's absolutely necessary, no doubt, and we need to explore all policies that enable us to do this. But I think besides governance and changes to more sustainable management practices, technological change is a real win and necessity too. I'll stop here now. And
Thanks, Henry. Yes, I don't think any of us is saying dietary shifts are going to be easy. Morgan, did you want to come in on this point?
Well, I was going to actually respond to the first question you asked, I think, from Stephen about, is there a unifying message that we need to be putting out? I'm going to put a controversial, maybe not controversial response out there, but from our experience, I think we're finding that we're not trying to get unifying messages to change everyone in the same way at the same time. We really need to meet people where they are, and what resonates in one context, in one country, in one city is going to be completely different than what resonates in a different country or different subnational country or a different city. And so the best thing that we can do is trying to shift these really challenging behaviors from corporate practices, from financial institutions, from people, is to really understand where they are, understand the challenges that they face. Is it economic? Is it health? Is it security? And then show them how, or help them to find solutions, empower them to find their own solutions. Because we know that lasting change is really about ownership, right? This can't be something that I come in and say, oh, Schengen, you need to do this thing. Schengen's going to say, no, I'm not going to do that thing. But if we can, empower Schengen to make a different choice, then that's a much longer lasting change. So, certainly in the work we're doing at FOLO, I think we're trying to move away from the one size fits all global unifying message of change, and really deepening our national and subnational work with local thought leaders, experts, farmers, scientists, modelers, who can really tailor and understand the local context to provide local solutions that will result in lasting change. So that's certainly where our thinking is at today. And to Henry, sorry, we'll respond to Henry's point. This is a little bit of a tongue-in-cheek comment, but Henry, we did an ice-breaking exercise at the FOLO Global Secretariat a couple of weeks ago, and one of the questions we asked was, what was the food you grew up with and what do you eat now? And all of us, and I come from Texas, I was born and bred on Texas barbecue. I was vegetarian for 10 years. And so these deep cultural sort of historical affections, associations with food are shifting, can be shifted in time. And, can it be done at the scale? I don't know. But, if you take a sample of folks, certainly that work in the environmental space, I think you'll be pretty not surprised to find that many of us have certainly shifted our diet already, recognizing the contribution that creates. Christina, back over to you.
Thanks, Morgan. Yes, and food is ultimately so personal, and I love that we've been able to get personal in this panel. We have lots of great questions still coming, so we're going to keep carrying on for a little bit longer. Please stay with us if you're able to. I want to shift back to the Convention on Biological Diversity for a minute, because we've talked about the climate change COP and the NDCs and how to get food and land use really more incorporated into those programs of work. But with the CBD COP coming imminently, well, in August for the decision-making session, but next week with the technical session, what concretely do we want to see in that about food and land use and food system transformation? What would be a good outcome? I don't know if anyone wants to tackle that specifically, but I'd love to hear some thoughts on that. Does anyone have particular ideas? Sarah, I see you coming off.
Yeah, I can just say that actually I think what's proposed is very good. Agriculture is quite clearly integrated. So the current proposal is for integrated land use planning that takes into account the need for biodiversity conservation. And if we can actually follow through and do that, that would be brilliant. And there's also a goal in there, an aspiration for conservation of genetic diversity, including in agricultural systems. So I think that the right ambitions are in there, and the task now is, first of all, for governments to ratify this proposal. It's still at the draft stage for now, and then for us to all support our governments and other actors in the food system to implement the changes that are needed.
So the text on the page is good, but what we need is countries to come and meet their commitments and abide by that framework. Got it. Any other thoughts or perspective on this?
Yeah, I have not read the let's say the statement or reports more carefully. I think repurposing the support is still very critical. So we still have lots of support that actually just do the opposite, destroy our environment, causing a huge loss of biodiversity. We must change that and use that money to protect, to save, a species and to produce healthy, nutritious, and sustainable foods. I hope there will be a statement that is much stronger.
Mm-hmm. Speaking to that specifically, speaking to repurposing subsidies. Got it. Any other perspectives for the CBD? Okay, I'm going to go around to everyone in just a minute and ask you what your key messages are, what you want to ensure participants from this webinar take away with them. But first, there's a good question from Tiana, who asks, what agreements do you assess realistically most countries could agree on to prevent the further degradation of nature promoted by unsustainable food systems? So where is there enough commonality? Where do we think there's a critical mass for agreement that we can build off of? Any takers on that one? It's a bit of a tough one. Henry, kick us off.
Yeah, I'll pick up on the COP26 outcomes on stopping deforestation and forest degradation. I think that's a really obvious one. And we know what to do in principle, how to stop deforestation and conversion of land due to food production. And a lot of this is driven by consumption in the global north, but also increasingly through large-scale land acquisitions and financialization of agriculture. Like it has very little to do sometimes even with needs and demands. So what I think that could be agreed upon across the three main conventions, because it is so critical to changing the trajectory of the emissions and restoring land, avoiding degradation, and maintaining biodiversity loss. I'll stop here. Thanks.
And of course, we saw great commitments at COP on forests and on restoration at the climate change COP. Morgan, do you want to come in?
I just wanted to flag, I mean, I'm sure folks already know about this, but particularly like where can governments find commonality on the CBD? The 30 by 30 coalition is a phenomenal example of that, right? So that's a coalition of governments and NGOs for a high ambition coalition for nature and people. They've called for this new target known as 30 by 30. It was endorsed by the G7 in May of last year, and it now has 68 countries that have supported it, basically calling to protect 30% of the Earth's land land and sea, sorry, it's an inclusive target, by 2030. And it's simple. It's catchy, but to have built a coalition of 68 countries around the world that are supporting this to protect biodiverse, rich lands, oceans, water supplies, et cetera, is obviously an area of where we're already seeing a lot of convergence, and something that I know folks are hoping will be help to drive greater ambition at the CBD.
Thanks for that, Morgan. I know there's a lot of chatter on the chat coming on all of these issues. It's a great conversation, and I wish we even had longer for it. I have a really quick question from Kai Kim, who asks, what sort of technical support can countries receive to strengthen their NDCs from a food and land perspective, and from whom? Anyone want to tackle that one? It's a pretty specific ask, but a good one, and I'm sure applicable to many. Morgan?
I'm gonna jump. I'm in FOLU, right? That's what we're here to do. And Sarah, Sarah's part of the FABLE team. FABLE has a fantastic, transition pathways modeling that work at national levels, where you can go sit down with governments and understand the really difficult conversations and trade-offs that need to happen as it relates to improving biodiversity, improving freshwater security, but also improving yield on land. So, the FABLE pathways is one great tool that we have. FABLE's sister initiative, does deep policy analysis. They were the ones that the NDC analysis that I shared, but again, an opportunity to sit down with governments at ministerial or below levels and say, look, these are your existing policies, these are your existing NDCs. We can highlight gaps and opportunities to strengthen these NDCs and support you in articulating type of policy shifts that you'll need to implement them. Similarly, we can talk about financing solutions, where there's many players that can support governments understanding financing solutions. The voluntary carbon market, controversial, but might be a new opportunity to facilitate and accelerate new capital flows to countries who are committed and willing and able to show that they're protecting their intact forests. So just a few off the top of my head, but there's a lot out there to provide technical to support two countries who are interested.
Fantastic. Thanks, Morgan. Shengen, do you want to come in?
Yeah, I think in addition to FOLU, CGIAR can also play a very big role. CGIAR, International Food Policy Research Institute, they do have models, they do have experts on production side, on consumption side, on environment. So they can actually act based on countries' requests. It's Indonesia or India or Ethiopia or any other countries that can request CGIAR to provide assistance. So in addition to the ambassador of FOLU, I'm also a board member of CGIAR. So a bit commercial here.
A bit of promotion, but two great institutions, so definitely worthy, and there are many more. We're running out of time rapidly, so I'm gonna do kind of a round robin, and I want each panelist to tell me one thing, just one message you want to be sure the audience takes away from the conversation today. And I'll go in the order that we did earlier on. So I'll start, Morgan, with you.
Yeah, we always like to end with a bit of a call to action, but I think that the key message that I want to land with today is there's going to be a lot of chat in the news and in the media in the coming weeks and months that we're going to have to throw out our environmental aims to ensure food security with the crisis that we're sort of seeing unfold in the Ukraine and others. And I really want to put a strong call out that's a myth. That's not true. As I said, we do not have to choose between economic growth, food security, and environmental sustainability. There's significant evidence, analysis, research, and otherwise that suggests and proves that these two things can happen at the same time. And even in light of the travesty that we're seeing, the spike in food prices, the impacts that this is going to cause on the most vulnerable people in the world, we need to double down on our environmental objectives at this time, not shy away from them, because the short, medium, and long-term benefits to people and for planet are vastly, vastly improved when we tackle these challenges in an integrated way. And so that's my call to action. Don't forget that the opportunity outweighs the cost. It can be done. It's up to us to do it.
Thanks, Morgan. Henry, I'm going to go to you next, and we're really short on time, so I'm asking you to be brief.
I will be very brief. I fully support Morgan's statement here and wanted to add, I'll focus on what I said multiple times already, that to achieve sustainable change on the ground, you need to take local stakeholders on board and make sure that they have clear benefits that they can identify as benefits. That is absolutely essential for achieving national and global adaptation, mitigation, sustainability goals. Thanks.
Thanks, Henry. So critical. Sarah, next to you.
Yeah, I also very much agree with what Morgan said, but I would also like to say that I think it's easy to be pessimistic. We often get doom and gloom stories about biodiversity and a lot of other things. And I would just like to remind all of us that if we want a better future for our children, it's up to us. We found ways that actually it's possible to achieve global food security and improve outcomes for biodiversity and improve the climate situation. And now's our chance. And if we leave it too much longer, then that chance is going to be gone.
Fantastic. It's up to us and the time is now. Shenggen, to close us off.
Yeah, okay, thank you. I'm very jealous of Hillary and IPCC. I think we needed to have a similar sort of intergovernmental agency for food system transformation. We need lots of data and lots of evidence, best practices, how we're going to move forward. So I wish if we have a sort of IPCC for food, that can provide very much needed data evidence to transform our food system. I will end over here. Thank you.
Fantastic, Shenggen. I think we've heard about the urgency. This is the decade. We're already 2 years into it, and we don't have enough action to show from it. Second, I think we really heard about the interlinkages between biodiversity loss and productive and resilient food systems. They're not disconnected, even though our governance systems often are of these different issues. But food production depends on biodiversity, and then biodiversity depends on us changing the way we produce and how we consume food. We depend on biodiversity from farm to fork, and really need to keep that in our minds and in our policy and in our decision making. I think the other point I just want to emphasize is the equity issue, that we can't leave anyone behind in making these decisions and making these changes. We need to think about equity at all times, and bring governments, companies, civil society, and farmers, indigenous peoples all along to produce equitable solutions. We have opportunities this year with the Biodiversity COP, with the climate change COP in Africa. And we really just need to seize the moment, as well as deliver that evidence and science that Shenggen, you just highlighted, and Henry has brought into the picture, and Sarah as well, and Morgan as well. So thank you all for being a part of this conversation today. We've got a lot of work to do ahead of us. Thank you for participating and sharing your thoughts. Definitely keep in touch. This is the first of many webinars that we're going to have this year. So please do keep in touch. Follow us at FOLU Coalition, and let's keep this dialogue going. Thanks, and have a great rest of your day. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye,
Bye, everyone.
everyone.
Good night.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.